Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the lecture that I'm going to be giving. This is the first lecture that I've ever given, so bear with me. The weather today is not exactly optimal. It's been storming all day, but this is the only opportunity that I'm going to have to do this lecture for the time being. So I would invite you to sit back and relax. I'm going to give a talk on writing and my thoughts on writing and reading, my philosophy on writing and reading. And I'm an author. I've written several books over the last few years. I'm going to be going into my background and things of that nature. And I'm also going to give examples, descriptive examples of writing techniques that I find to be very useful. So this is going to be a rather long lecture, I think. I honestly don't know. It depends on how long it takes me to get through the entire outline here. I will also be, again, reading passages from my work, mostly from my latest book, Silent Reckoning, but I will also be reading from my previous work as well. Um, so I will be discussing, again, all of those things. So first I thought I would give you some background information about myself. Well, I first wanted to be a writer when I was 13 years old. I didn't really have that desire early on. Mainly because when I was a kid, I couldn't read very well. My handwriting was very poor and still is, as a matter of fact, and so I wasn't really encouraged to write or read or anything like that. Teachers often made fun of me, which is probably why I don't really have fond memories of school or anything like that. So if someone looked at me when I was 5 or 10 years old, they would not have thought, well, this guy is going to be a writer. They would not have thought of that in the least. And so the first time, though, that I really started becoming interested, though, in stories, not necessarily in writing, but in stories, was because of my grandfather, who would read to me as a child. He would often tell scary stories. He would often discuss legends or things that happened to him as a child. There were these two characters that he made up called Bobby and Bobby and Rick would go on adventures, and something terrible would often happen to Rick. He would become poisoned or something like that. But my grandfather definitely instilled within me a deep love of storytelling. And so, around when I was in the eighth grade, I was introduced to Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe, when I read him, it was really the first time that I felt like I was being exposed to real literature. And he really inspired my imagination, and especially I loved the poetic fervor of his language. And also around that time, my grandfather helped me to read more by reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to me. It was an abridged version, but we read the book together, and that inspired a lot of passion within me. Unfortunately, by the time that I became very interested in reading and in writing and all of that, my grandfather, who had written several books himself, or a book himself, he wrote a book about our family history. He no longer had the ability to do that because he became sick with dementia, and that's a whole separate story I could go into. But so that was very unfortunate, but I'll always be grateful for my grandfather for inspiring me to read, for giving me all of that inspiration. And so I started writing around 2009, 2010, several short stories and books, mostly by hand. I wrote this book called Dragon Wars, which was kind of a fantasy story, and then I wrote a sequel to it. And I also wrote this novel called Mr. Green, which was about this promiscuous landlord and how he had an alternate personality called Mr. Red. And that was a very funny book in some ways. It's not Mr. Green is not available though anywhere to read or anything like that. It is. I have the only copy available. In fact, the computer that I had it on, I think, has been destroyed. So only one physical copy of that story is left. But Mr. Green was a very terrible book in some ways. It was one of the first books that I had ever written, but it did help me hone my craft somewhat. And I also wrote a short story that I tried to get published in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, which I'm actually really surprised and shocked about how different the publishing world 10 years ago was versus now. Because when I tried to get that short story published, you still had to mail short stories to people and do all these really complex things. It was a really harsh ordeal that you had to go through, and I'm so glad now that everything is digital and online. It makes things a lot easier. Then, of course, in 2013, I wrote a story called The Landlord, which was a novella that I put as an ebook online. The Landlord is no longer available to purchase. I took it down recently, mainly because the story has some themes and some elements that I don't quite agree with now, and it was also very flawed in some ways. So that was another story, though, that I wrote. And then for around 3 years between 2014 and 2016, I wrote around 200 short stories. There was a time where I was writing 3, 4 short stories a week, and I'm very glad that I went through that period of writing nothing but short stories, because I think it really did help me hone my craft by writing constantly. And in fact, I would advise any writer to practice by just writing short stories for a lengthy period of time. Not that short stories are inherently inferior; they're not. They present their own level of challenges and all of that, and so. But I do think writing short stories is a good idea. Now, most of these short stories I wrote in a very minimalistic kind of style, so they're not very complex in many ways. I mainly tried to come up with plot twists that I would devise at the end of a story. So you would get to the end of a story and it would be like, oh, there's this big twist, and many of the short stories were more like jokes in some ways than actual fleshed out stories. And of course, I put some of them in the book that I wrote in 2015 called Dark Tales of Mystery and Crime, which is available. Of course, if you purchase that, just know that it doesn't really reflect how I write now. And then in around 2017, I wrote The Rains of Godwin Valley, which is a Western kind of story. And it is a bit rough around the edges, that book, but it does contain, I think, the beginning of how I write now, that you can see how I would develop that style over time. And then in 2018, I wrote the book Empty Sounds of the Wind, which is a kind of a noirish thriller. It was actually a very successful, a very popular book. I posted it on this website called Booksy, where I sometimes will post books before in order to get feedback before I publish them on Amazon, and it became one of the most popular stories on the website, one of the most shelved stories on the website out of thousands. I still think it's within the top 10. And then I wrote the book Symphony of Perdition in 2019, and then I wrote and Symphony of Perdition is very hard to categorize. It deals with a lot of complex moral themes and all. And then in 2020, I wrote Mournful Wanderer, which is basically a gothic ghost story. And then in 2021 and part of 2022, I wrote Silent Reckoning, which, again, it is difficult to classify as well, but it resembles The Great Gatsby in some ways. It has elements of being noir, but it also has elements of being a Shakespearean tragedy. It combines many different elements. And speaking of Shakespeare, writers like Shakespeare and Dickens truly have inspired me to write, mainly because writers like Shakespeare and Dickens and Poe and they wrote with a poetic fervor. They tried to make their language very beautiful and very, I guess you could say, linguistically complex. And for some reason, I've always loved creating language that is linguistically poetic or beautiful or complex, and I find that to be just such a euphoric experience, and it is a very euphoric experience for me, and it's something that I truly love doing. And in fact, I would say that aspect of writing I love more than anything else, and it's hard to know exactly why when it comes to things like this, but but I just love doing that, and hopefully, by talking about some of the ways that I go about doing that, you can learn something from these techniques. I don't claim to be an expert in any of these areas. I'm just a writer, a lot like you possibly are, or perhaps you want to become a writer, or perhaps you're just a reader and you're curious about how writers come up with these things. Of course, a lot of writing techniques are instinctual. I don't really think about how do I go about doing such a thing when I'm doing it. Very often, I only analyze certain techniques that I utilize after the fact. So, first, I'm going to give you some examples of writing about ambiance, and I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples in order to get across exactly what I mean by ambiance. So, I'm going to give you first. I'm going to give you an example from Silent Reckoning, from the opening passages of Silent Reckoning, and this is definitely going to be the longest passage that I read, but I feel that it's necessary in order to give you a profound sense of what I mean by atmosphere and ambiance. Before I was even a whisper in my mother's thoughts, it seemed as if the world had already forgotten me. I was born on August 25th, 1893. The world was completely different then. I still recall the echoes of the horses in the streets, the gallant way in which they trotted along the pavements. The air was clean, almost unnaturally so, and there seemed to be a radiant innocence to almost everything. The clouds in the sky, possibly in response to the purities in our hearts, were enchantingly serene. On and on the days shimmered, never once beholden to the shadows of midnight. All day long I heard soft piano music. The sunlight orchestrated the euphoric melodies, intensifying their auspicious cadences. There was no pain, there was no heartbreak. Whatever darkness existed, whatever melancholy drifted through my frivolous gestures, was ultimately drowned out by the hymns of morning. My mother had a very strident nature. In various ways, I suppose, she was truly the last of the great Victorian matriarchs. Her expressions were always meticulously conceptualized, having an almost regal disposition. She came from practically nothing, at least from what I understand, but there was always a noble effervescence in her rapport with the world. As I watched her slender fingertips graze over the piano, I often thought to myself, why are the most beautiful flowers always so fragile? Yes, on the shallow surface she maintained a resilient composition, both in manner and in posture, but just beneath the surface of her rubescent cheeks, to her utter and eternal bereavement, existed a delicacy that not even the angels in heaven could expunge. It was her burden to bear, her cross to carry, and her demon to exorcise. One day, when I was about 5, I believe, I entered our small drawing room, my hands and feet trembling against the light swaying of the door. Just a few moments before, my ears had detected the faint sobbing of my mother. Up until that moment, I had never heard her express her emotion so passionately, so poignantly. It was as though all of the melancholy saturations in the world flourished in her visage, in her austere elegance, and in her feline gaze. The evening light was fading, its rhetorical vigor replaced with the artificiality of timidity. The sophomoric candlelight enticed the pervasive twilight, creating a demure haze. The piano released melodic overtures of somber reckonings, completely in sync with the sultry glistenings. I recall, quite vividly in fact, that as my petite hand touched her soft robe, her cries seemed to intensify. Although I can't be precisely certain, it almost seemed as if I represented a spectral grievance from her past. My youthful presence, as opposed to being rife with blissful cultivations, only reminded her of the irrevocable travesties that weighed ardently on her pensive repose. At one time radiating an almost angelic luminosity, her facial lustriousness succumbed to the grayish spectrums of licentious perditions, bereaving her of all purity. Now, that's a pretty long passage, but I thought it was necessary to read the entire thing to you so you could get a sense of what I mean by ambiance. Of course, I use several different techniques here. One is sound, of course, by describing the sounds of the horses in the street and all of those things. I immediately evoke images of the past, of what it was like to live in the past, because this is, of course, is a character who is speaking from the present in the 1920s, but she's looking back on the 1890s, which even though it was only 30 years before, there was a huge difference, especially in major metropolitan areas, between the 1890s and the 1920s, because of course the internal combustion engine became more popular, and electricity and industrialization and all of those things. So it was really, if you look at the first half of the 20th century, it was really a huge leap in that regard, and so people have to keep that in mind. And then of course I also tried to I compared the day to melodies and things of that nature, because if you try to give to compare certain aspects of nature to certain conceptualizations of art and things of that nature, then it will evoke a more potent image in the reader's mind by doing so. And then, of course, I compared different light sources. I tried to compare artificial light with natural light, because when artificial light and natural light blend together, it creates a very distinct and almost hazy kind of look. And so I thought that I captured that within the writing itself. So that's one example of ambiance, but let me give you a second example, and this is from my book Symphony of Perdition, which I wrote several years ago. As Edward led Susan across the meadow, several unexpected feelings, some of them quite sinister, entered Sam's heart. His breathing, on the whole, had become far more chaotic. His breathing started low, like an unguided symphony, before increasing in speed, losing all sense of stability and rhythm. Directly above him, the sun started to awaken, just barely breaking through the thick line of clouds. He tried to look into the sky, but his rapid breathing, though seemingly harmless, prevented him from enjoying the innocent aspects of life, such as looking at the genesis of a sunrise or taking in the swan song of a dwindling afternoon, for the pain proved to be too great. Now, one of the reasons why I really love that passage is because I gave the sun a beginning and an end. That the sun, like life itself, has a cycle, and all cycles, of course, have beginnings and they have ends. And so I think that by talking about the genesis of a sunrise or the swan song of an afternoon, I give the sun a kind of odyssey that I think makes it easier for you to visualize the image. And by associating the cycle of nature with pain, I give nature a human-like characteristic that I think the average reader can relate to. So now let me give you another example of ambiance, and this example has to do with city life, and again, this is from my book, Silent Reckoning. The city was alive once again. The remnants of the night, although still somewhat potent, no longer held sway over the tempestuous bustles of everyday life. Walter continued to stare at the sidewalk, almost incapable of confronting the hazardous realities of existence. Around every corner, every intersection, displays of opulent modernity awaited him. In a very brief period of unspecified interludes, the world as he had once known it had completely unraveled. Peering into the hearts of the ornately constructed automations, ornaments of times gone by gradually materialized, instilling the centers with faint compositions of archaic innovations. The wheels on the vehicles were seeded into the continuities of temporal time, replaced swiftly by dexterous manifestations of soft flesh. Well bred in almost every conceivable manner, the legs galloped and trotted, as if eager to acquiesce the whip that encroached upon them. The echoes of the feet, combined with the persistent clattering of the whip, brought a sense of tranquility to Walter's disenfranchised contemplations. No longer plagued by the unsentimental cries of industrialization, the streets were endowed with vocalizations of primordial nature. Now, what is happening there is that he is thinking about the past, because the character of Walter Peterson is living in the 1920s, but he's thinking about what it was like to live in the 1890s when he was a child. So the past and the present are merging together. So he's imagining these industrialized cars, but he's also imagining horses at the same time, so the cars are turning into horses, and therefore, so he's confused mentally because he's trapped in two separate time periods, and then so his mind and reality are becoming one, and he can't always distinguish his mind from reality, and so that's what I was trying to do with that particular passage. And now I'll read you the final example of what I think makes for good ambiance. Walter closed his eyes, not yet adjusted to the soulful hymns of the wind. They floated on the tides of the ocean, disappearing into the depths, hopefully to resurface once again. The tides rocked with a benevolent reticence, surprisingly acquiescent to the docile beguilements within the modest breezes. Trickling against the shoreline, the water refined the rigidities embedded in the rocks, each stroke endowed with heavenly nourishments. Soon after, the shoreline radiated sparkles of an almost divine orientation, for even the birds in the sky turned their eyes towards the wondrous marriage of earth and sea. Far off in the distance, a boat clung helplessly to the serene fluencies encased in the waves, fully at the mercy of their cooperation. The new dawn was blooming, bound by the night no longer. Now, I had a cough there because I'm still recovering from the coronavirus, which I had recently. But wish I had brought some water out with me, but I didn't. But this passage has to do with of course, with the ocean and nature and all that. And I think that this passage makes a good use of personification, of by describing the tides as benevolent, of saying that they have a type of reticence that it gives the waves and the tides a certain kind of demeanor that I think really will evoke images in your mind, and how I'm also contrasting different elements of nature, of earth and sea. So I think that if you have an image of the earth and you have an image of the sea, and then the writing combines those together, that will also create a more vivid image in your mind. So now I'm going to move on to giving you examples of character description, describing physical characteristics, metaphorical characteristics, and I have several examples of those. And this is from the passage I'm reading now, is from the second chapter of Silent Reckoning. Walter Peterson dreamt of Jeannie long before he ever laid eyes upon her. During twilight, often while clenching the sheets that enveloped his quivering body, he visualized her scarlet lips, her porcelain complexion. But it was not until he visited the Umbracious Movie House, an establishment often referred to as the Palace, that he truly witnessed the zenith of her immaculate sensuality. As the curtain parted from the dust-covered screen, pigments of luminous light seized the auditorium, as if eager to exhibit the maximum potency of the moving image. Although the images were unaccompanied by sound, their visceral splendor more than compensated. A glistening pasture materialized on the screen, its wavering hills evoking sentiments of elemental serenity. Following several intervals of blissful stagnation, the figure of a woman manifested on the screen, her features obscured by the vibrancy of the projector. As the light succumbed to the sweltering darkness, the refined lineaments that encompassed her visage became distinguishable. Her physiognomy encapsulated the radiance of youthful auroras, the luminosity of midnight moons, and the resplendent fervor of sultry twilights. Now, the reason why I like that passage is because I'm comparing, of course, her physiognomy, Jeannie's physiognomy, to aspects of nature, which, if you can compare someone's physical characteristics to aspects of nature, then that will ultimately create a more vivid and potent image in the reader's mind, because you're associating the night or the twilight with a particular kind of person. And so I think that by describing certain aspects of nature, it ultimately will create a far more potent, I guess you could say, image, which I think I successfully did within this passage. And also the description is somewhat exaggerated because it's coming from Walter's point of view, who obviously has a crush on Jeannie Anderson. So it's coming from his point of view. So the description is somewhat dreamlike because it's how he's seeing her and not necessarily how Jeannie actually is in reality. So the second example goes, my eyes were like two burning candles. They desperately desired to convey the torrid fevers that haunted my passions, but the flares, never so poignant as they were in that moment, dissolved into the candelabras of my eye sockets. Every crease in my skin... Hold on. Every crease in my skin, whether symmetrical or curved, was like a snowflake straining against the ghost of summer. My eyes were the pearls through which winter shone. Now, also, by describing certain physical characteristics to aspects of nature, that will also create a more vivid image because you are because you see you see the person's eyes, and then if you compare someone's eyes to winter, then you're going to think of eyes that are very pale, that reflect the somberness of winter, and or the melancholy of winter, and all of those things. So I think comparing physical characteristics to seasons is a good idea. So now this passage is from the beginning of my book Mournful Wanderer. This next example. Even in mourning, Alice Bloomington remained tranquil, almost as though she somehow suspected that her son hadn't truly perished from the world. Most astonishingly, her gaze stayed linear, focused, and without tension. Laden with regret, Alice was perfectly motionless, never even once swaying her legs. The tender sentiments of grief, although quite potent, only loosely entered her heart. They violently attacked her resilient nature, occasionally even penetrating it, but she always managed to repel them, albeit only momentarily. She grasped her diary in her hands, gently stroking its soft edges. Leisurely tilting her head, Alice's eyes drifted towards her pale fingertips. Her moist palms firmly attached themselves to the withered pages, the pressure steadily increasing. Caught between states of vitality and fragility, her lips quivered as she turned the pages, directly above which emerged the soft creases within her jawline. Now, the reason why I like this passage is because it deals with physical movement, because one of the things that I like doing in books is to, if you can align someone's physical movement, for example, with their gaze, with their gaze or something like that, then you can create. Then you can almost live inside the character, because you are seeing things from their point of view on a very visceral level. Because if someone's because if your line of thinking and the character's line of thinking match up, then you will basically be living within the character's flesh, so to speak. And also by someone's gestures, physical gestures, can reflect their state of mind. The way they hold something, the way they use their fingers to tap, that can show that they have a certain state of mind, that they are living within a certain state of mind. So I think this passage captures that very well. And of course, for the final example, when it comes to character description, this is also from this is from Silent Reckoning. This is a scene where you have the character of Ursula Chapman, who is roaming through her apartment with a bath towel because someone has knocked on her door. So, but I particularly really love this passage. Stepping into the lonely vacuity of my living room, all was suddenly silent. Back and forth, the chandelier dolefully undulated, aroused by the lucrative tremors of my toes. Draped in curtains of velvety opulence, the rectangular configurations of glass invited the glow of the city into the mortuary of hapless clarities. somewhat resembling manifestations of creamy snow. The flurries of pale gray enshrined their beauteous ornaments upon my crescent lips, and for a moment it almost seemed as if I had become a living incarnation of moonlight. Now, one of the reasons why I really enjoy this passage is because the uh, the character of Ursula Chapman uh, is taking on the characteristics of nature, and in some ways that makes it almost the opposite of personification, which personification is giving assigning human-like characteristics to inanimate objects, but in this case, I'm assigning nature-like characteristics to a human, so which I think is a very unique thing to do because if you can because human beings, we are a part of nature after all, and the line between where humans end and where nature ends can be very blurry. So I think that if you describe a human being like they are a ray of moonlight or something like that, then that will ultimately create a far more potent and vivid image because we were born in nature and nature is a part of us, and when you combine those two things, I think you will create some I guess you could say some very potent language. So now I'm going to move on to giving you examples of describing emotion, which which is something that is often overlooked within books. But describing emotion is something that is very important because it can give you a sense of who the character is and various other things. So this is a scene, a very dramatic scene within Silent Reckoning when something very terrible is happening to one of the characters. My lips attempted to conceptualize a retort, but before they could orchestrate their muscular elasticities, they were enveloped by his all-encompassing embrace. Like a disheveled doll in the hands of a facetious child, my body was mercilessly defiled. My ligaments went limp, my irises succumbed to vacuity, and my soul shattered into 1,000 diminutive fragments. Every kiss felt like a dagger to the heart. My mind drifted into a stasis of passive apathy, inside of which lingered only desolation. The shadows of midnight beckoned to my sensitivities, and I was forever a ghost. Now, what is happening in that scene is that the character is being defiled in some ways, and this is a good passage, I think, of reacting to trauma of of a character experiencing trauma, and sometimes traumatic events can, metaphorically speaking, murder you. They can make it where you feel like you are detached from the world, and that you no longer have an idea of what's going on. And I think this passage captures that aspect very well because this event basically destroyed Jeannie Anderson, and I think that if you read the story, you'll understand what I mean by it. But I think this is a very powerful passage for that reason. So this is another example that I'm giving of describing emotion. This is also from Silent Reckoning towards the end of the book. Seemingly all at the same time, my ligaments suddenly felt very light. Over the crowns of my pulsating eyes, a translucent cloud veiled itself, obscuring my lucid acuities. I draped my hand across my chest, bereft of respiratory sustenance. Every breath, every undulation, was marred with 1,000 hubristic lamentations. Once resolutely obstinate, my pride was entombed within a sepulchre of misbegotten chimeras. My star had been extinguished, and in its place, over the ashes of my heartfelt machinations, was the sweet acquiescence of colloquial resignation. As my dour gaze transfixed on Walter's pugnacious countenance, the autumnal flurries of my soul turned to winter, and under the lugubrious light of morning, the centers of my pupils, already wreathed in acrimonious nectars, became emissaries for the tragic ecstasies of creation. Now, the reason why I like this sentence is because it presents physical characteristics or physical features as being conduits for emotional states that sometimes our physical features can represent what we are feeling inside. And sometimes I also think it is a good idea to compare tears to nectar and ambrosia and various other things because if you can compare a tear to another liquidy substance, then that can ultimately create a more vivid image if you are associating that with another kind of image like wine or something like that. And sometimes our features and our tears can affect us like drugs almost. That sometimes the body itself can be a kind of drug if it experiences a really profound emotion. And so now I'm going to give you another example, which this example requires a bit of dialogue for you to understand exactly what I mean by this passage. So this passage is from my book, Symphony of Perdition, towards the end of the book. Susan ventured away from Edward's arm, aware only of the gentle breeze on her fragile face. She ventured towards the stream, very nearly stepping in it, but at the last second her feet came to a complete halt. Almost as an afterthought, Susan scooped some of the water into her hand, sipping it gently, delicately, and smoothly. She savored every aspect of the water, the taste not mattering nearly as much as the texture, an aspect which could not be replaced. You know, I've always loved this water. It's clean and innocent, much like I was once, so very long ago, she observed. Now, the reason why I like, excuse me, the reason why I like this passage is because her physical actions are representative of her emotion. That by going down and scooping the water into her hand, she is wanting to break free from everything that is holding her back, from everything that is constraining her, and people often want to use nature to escape. So that's another thing you can do in your book, is that you can show that a character is wanting to escape through nature, that they're wanting to get away by using nature as an outlet or an oasis to escape their past, to escape their emotions, to escape so many different things. And I think this passage demonstrates that quite well. Now, here's another passage from Silent Reckoning towards the end of the book, and it basically sums up what the main character is feeling about their life, and I think this passage does a good job of representing that. Some people die before they are ever truly born. I died 1,000 times, but only lived once. I lived because I loved, and that made all the difference. Brought to life by the nectars of passion, I danced in a sun that shone even in darkness. I tasted the sweetness of youth, the ecstasy of prosperity, and the agony of fulfilled dreams. At my fingertips the world shimmered, much like a diamond glistening in a pale meadow. I was nature's most prized ornament, one which was placed on the pedestal of creation. As the passionate nectars ran dry, the orbeus glow dimmed, and I was left alone. Love brought me to life, but in the end I realized that what seemed like love was simply the bitter flow of time, upon which I was merely a sailor. Now, the reason why I like this passage is because it's bringing abstract concepts into tangible reality. By comparing time to the ocean, for example, it makes the concept of time, which is an abstract thing, tangible. It's something that you can imagine in your head. It's something that you can visualize quite easily. And so I think this passage does a good job of representing that. It makes love into an elemental force, something that, because the concept of love, which can be very abstract, suddenly becomes something tangible and real. So I think this passage does a good job of representing all of that. And now I thought I would give you some examples of dialogue that I think, because dialogue is something that is often overlooked because we often associate it more with movies, but dialogue is also very integral to any story because it can help reveal the exterior layers and thinking of a character. So I'm going to read to you this passage, which is also from Silent Reckoning, that the character Jeannie Anderson that the character of Jeannie Anderson is talking to her rival, Ursula Chapman, and basically revealing what she thinks of her. Once upon a time, my heart was very much like yours. It was so pure, so unspoiled. It was like the first pencil of light on a spring morning. At first, you think the light will stay forever, but the night must come, and with it the proliferation of stardust agonies. Eventually, you're left with the shadow of a memory that was only ever a dream. Now, this passage is very reminiscent of of a passage from Hamlet, which I did not realize at the time, which has to do with the idea of shadows and memories only ever really being dreams. Because sometimes when we look at the past, it's very difficult to distinguish what is real or what actually happened in the past from our dreams, from our fantasies. It can be the past is a very slippery thing, and I think that she's getting that across quite well here. And it also represents the idea of longing for times that never were, that perhaps never actually existed. Okay, and now I'm going to read to you another passage that deals with the past. In fact, all of these passages in these examples deal with the past in some ways. And this comes from a monologue that Jeannie Anderson gives in the middle of the story. You talk as if the past is a singular manifestation. As a matter of fact, it never has been. It's more like an opaque and desolate labyrinth. There are a myriad of corridors and passageways, each with their own subset of traumatic verisimilitudes. They are without voice, without exoneration, and can only ignite within the centers of our eyes, the gateways to our souls. They shape our expressions, our constitutions, and always with the weight of eternity on their shoulders. Without them, we would be barren canvases. In the end, we are merely the clay that time uses to sculpt its wonders, Jeannie said. Now, the reason why I like this passage is because it's the idea of a character acknowledging that there are certain forces that are outside of their control, that there's only so much that they can do in order to control their destiny, and that there's only so much they can do in order to succeed. And that's what Jeannie Anderson is acknowledging here. And it's the idea that fate controls our destiny, that in some ways that we are shaped by forces outside of our control. And I think ultimately that this is what this passage is saying. It's the idea that we don't shape our destiny, that there's an outside force shaping our destiny. And so now I'm going to read to you a passage from my book, Empty Sounds of the Wind, which I have so far neglected to read any passage. And this is a very brief passage. In fact, it's only a sentence. It comes towards the end of the story when a character is about ready to die, and his dying words are, "The past is dead, and so am I." Now, I think that is a very profound passage, because it's the even though it's very brief, because it's the idea that he is surrendering to the past and acknowledging that there's nothing left for him, that there's nothing left to do except for him to die, and so I think that ultimately is a good representation of what his character is trying to get across. And I'm sorry about the rain and everything, but I don't really have any other place that I can give this lecture or do this, so I keep hoping that the rain or the weather will calm down. It hasn't so far, but bear with me. We're towards the end of the lecture, but there's still quite a bit I have to read to you. And also, his character, by saying that he is, it represents a kind of climax that is occurring in the story. And so now I'm going to read to you the last passage that I think of good dialogue. This is a kind of monologue that occurs towards the end of the story where the character of Jeannie Anderson is kind of expressing how she truly feels about things. Between love and hatred, death has no prejudice. Love could last 100 years, experience 100 summers. But summer must pass into autumn, the season where passion turns cold. Is frigid passion any different than hatred? Can fire thrive without the sweet tenderness of warmth? Sleepless time will pass into winter, undoubtedly the sepulchre for all forlorn loves. In the great mausoleum of winter, the song of disillusionment will play, and the serene light of day will become impotent. Without light, dreams shall descend into shadow, ornamenting the face of love no longer. Through the vast sea of eternity, love might flourish, but it will never endure. Barren and fragile, love shall pass through a phantasmagoria of acrimonious frigidity, incessantly flowing on the sinuous rivers of time, of chimeric disillusionment, all the while basking in the bittersweet agony of hatred, due to which the water will freeze into eternity, much like an opalescent sky fading into night, and when death finally does descend upon the Arctic enclave, it will discover that love was hatred's silent dream. Now, what, but what this passage does, excuse me, is it it gives you a good representation of what she is feeling emotionally, because it's a monologue about disillusionment. It's about the idea of completely surrendering to your fate, and it also kind of gives you a climactic resonance in the book, which I think is very profound. It's the idea that the character has given up all hope and that there's nothing left for her to do except for her to kind of jump into a river and die, which is exactly what she does. And of course, I'm not going to tell you how it all turns out, but I think but this passage is ultimately about disillusionment, about despair. It kind of, in some ways, mirrors the to be or not to be speech in some ways. Now, I would like to say a few words about writing themes and all of those things that are separate from writing technique. For one thing, try to be as nuanced as possible. Try to be that when writing themes, when creating themes, don't just try to evoke one point of view. Try to evoke multiple points of view, so the audience will have different things to think about. That they can think about. If you make your point of view less clear, that will ultimately create more nuance, and which is what you want. Because I think that if a writer, if their moral message, whatever it is, if it's too heavy-handed, then it will put the audience off, because it will feel like that, because the audience will feel like that the writer isn't really trying to create a work of artistic complexity. And therefore, even if you have a certain point of view, if you write your story or work in a certain way where your point of view is being challenged, then that will ultimately strengthen the point of view that you do have, which is another reason why you should try to be nuanced. And also you want the audience to make up its mind at the end of the day, because that's more interesting than giving a sermon about some kind of moral belief or something like that. You want things to be as nuanced as possible, as complex as possible, and I think that's the job of the artist. It isn't to preach a certain point of view. If you want to do that, then be a preacher, be a politician, be something else, but don't be an artist. And also, I think when writing themes, that ultimately everything, it comes down to hubris. The hubris of the villain, the hubris of of the main character. It's about the idea that the main character has a weakness, and ultimately that weakness is going to draw them into danger. It's going to draw them into a conflict that they might not be able to get out of. It's going to draw them into a realm where they might not want to go, and ultimately a character's downfall will be because of their hubris, because of the idea that they can't get out of something, that they can't get away from something, and as long as you have that in mind, you will create a very compelling story. And also when creating characters, be sure to read widely, to not just stick to one kind of reading. You want to read things that will you want to read classical books, more modern kinds of books, even though I probably need to do a better job of reading more modern kinds of books. You want to read things that will inspire you, perhaps even gross you out at times. You want to read widely. You want to come away with a variety of different perspectives, so you can create your own unique work, and also make sure that nature ultimately, when writing, I think nature, it's not about just describing nature as it objectively exists in the world. Ultimately, it is about you're using nature in order to describe the emotional states of the characters, and therefore, nature will be distorted to a certain degree because you're not trying to give an objective view of what nature means and all of those things. You're giving a view of how the characters feel about nature, and not necessarily how nature actually exists in the world. And now I wanted to say a few words about about publishing and all of those things. Well, a lot of times people will ask me for writing advice. Well, the ultimate piece of writing advice that I can give is to never compromise your vision. That don't listen to other people. Don't even listen to me. Listen to your heart, and ultimately, you have to write the kind of books that you want to write, and not necessarily the kind of books that other people want you to write, because you don't want to spend months, weeks, or years on something and not like it, because here's the thing: is that even if you do write a book in order to appease other people, they still might not like it, and if you don't like it either, then where will you be? So ultimately, you have to write the kind of books that you want to read, and I think that traditional publishing is very restrictive. That it doesn't. It's all about making money. It's not about actually creating any kind of vision. It's not about being innovative. Traditional publishing is very restrictive in that way, and therefore I would only accept a traditional publishing deal if the publisher gave me a lot of freedom, gave me the appropriate amount of royalties and all of those things, which they certainly won't do, and therefore I think it's better to publish on your own terms, to write in your own way, and to not listen to other people, including myself, and but ultimately it's up to you. It's your life. But regardless of what you do, I think that reading and writing will definitely help improve your personality. It will make life just so much richer, and I hope I have encouraged you to do that today. But I would like to end with this quote that comes from my book Silent Reckoning, which I think is a very powerful quote, and I think sums up what one's philosophy should be about life. People do not have to die in order to understand the poignancy of death. Many people have spent their lives rehearsing for the infinite sleep, and when death finally came knocking, they realized that they had never truly been awake. Thank you.